Rather surprisingly, given the thoroughness of the French Revolution, the French have retained much more of their medieval regalia than the English have, although the majority was still lost between 1590 and 1793. In this video, I will discuss the crowns and other regalia used by the Capetian, Valois and Bourbon dynasties, both the items that have been lost and those that miraculously still survive. Now, I'm not going to discuss here Napoleon Bonaparte's imperial regalia. That will come in a later video about his coronation, for Napoleon's regalia and his imperial robes reflect aspects of continuity with the past, but a marked degree of innovation. Until 1793, most of the French royal regalia was kept together in one place, in the Treasury of the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis on the edge of Paris. Founded by Dagobert, king of the Franks in the 7th century, Saint-Denis was the primary royal abbey and burial place of the French kings until the French Revolution. Interestingly, from the 12th century, the coronation of French kings didn't take place at Saint-Denis, but rather at the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Reims. There was a good reason for that, as we will see as the video progresses. So whenever a king of France was crowned, the regalia in the treasury at Saint-Denis had to be carted nearly 100 miles to Reims. At the centre of the regalia in the treasury was an extensive collection of crowns, and as in England, the French had crowns for different purposes. There were coronation crowns and personal crowns. The latter were made and remade for successive generations. Two of the crowns in the collection were very old and of paramount importance, the so-called crowns of Charlemagne and St. Louis. The first of these two crowns, the crown of Charlemagne, was perhaps the most ancient. It was the coronation crown of French kings. Although the tradition was that the crown was indeed that of Charlemagne, king of the Franks and first Holy Roman Emperor, this is highly unlikely. Part of the crown may well have dated back to the 9th century and to the reign of Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, king of West Francia from 843 to 877 and briefly Holy Roman Emperor. Images of the crown are scarce. We have to rely on evidence of what it looked like from an engraving of 1706 published in Dom Michel Philibion's History of the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis. Philibion included in his work 5 engravings of the cabinets in the treasury and what they looked like in 1706. From this engraving, it appears that the crown consisted of a circlet that was topped by 4 fleurs-de-lis. The circlet was perhaps the oldest element of the crown, and it may have been from the 9th century. It was similar in design and style to the 9th century iron crown of Lombardy, which Charles the Bald may well have been crowned with as King of Italy. Now, the fleurs-de-lis in the 9th century were not part of the royal symbolism of the Franks. It is likely that the fleurs-de-lis were added to the crown for the coronation of Philip Augustus in 1179, the first king of the Franks to style himself King of France. It is thought that either his father, Louis VII, or his grandfather, Louis VI, first used the fleur-de-lis, which is a symbol of the Virgin Mary's purity, as the emblem of their royal house in the first half of the 12th century. The crown of Charlemagne appears to have been set with some stones, though the colour, the size and the number of them is quite unknown. There appears to have been a near identical crown for the Queen's use, probably made for Philip Augustus. It was no longer extant in 1706, for in 1590, during the siege of Paris during the French wars, it was melted down. After the loss of the crown, French queens were then crowned with the 14th century personal crown of Jeanne d'Evreux, the third wife of King Charles IV. The second of the principal crowns, the crown of St. Louis, is shown in this colour drawing of the 18th century. As with the crown of Charlemagne, the date of its creation is a mystery. Some argue, based on its style, that it was made in the 11th century, but the general consensus is that it was made for Louis IX, who reigned as King of France between 1226 and 1270 and was canonised as a saint in 1297. In form and design, it emulated the crown of Charlemagne, but was richer. On the crown's band were 4 garnets or balass rubies, alternating with 4 large sapphires separated by pairs of emeralds. On the fleur-de-lis were 2 garnets, an emerald, a topaz, surrounded by a sapphire. On the front fleur-de-lis was set a very large table emerald. Over 100 pearls adorned the crown's band and the fleurons. This crown was most probably a personal crown, but it survived destruction and remodelling in the late medieval and early modern period, as it was also a reliquary, and as such it was often referred to as the Holy Crown of France. For behind the front ballast ruby was set a thorn from the crown of thorns. Now, St. Louis is famous for bringing to France the supposed relic of Christ's crown of thorns that is now in Notre Dame. However, the thorn used in the crown predates that. It was given to the abbey by Louis VI early in the 12th century. St. Louis's crown seems to have been little worn. It was used apparently for John II's coronation, but was generally just carried in procession before the French king when he was present in the abbey, and then laid on the altar. The crown is depicted in two paintings: in the Mass of St. Giles in the National Gallery, that deserves a video all of its own, and in the painting of the Virgin of the Family of Vic in the Church of St. Nicholas des Champs. In the former painting it is shown to have arches on the top of it, but whether it ever did have is unclear. None of the coronation crowns survived the revolution. They were all lost in 1793, the metal melted down and the stones dispersed. However, in the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, there is a large emerald of 51.6 carats, known as the Emerald of St. Louis, and it may be the one from the front fleur-de-lis of St. Louis's crown. In addition to the coronation crowns, there were a whole host of personal crowns for different sovereigns. These were used in much the same way as the English imperial state crown was used, and they were depicted in the official coronation portraits of French kings. In the Treasury in 1706, there were personal crowns belonging to Henry IV, Louis XIII and Louis XIV. There were also funerary crowns that were used to top the coffins at royal funerals. While the French coronation crowns were evidently without arches, as were the medieval personal crowns, these early modern French personal crowns were topped with a series of arches, either 8 or 12. Only one of the personal crowns has survived, that of Louis XV. Made for the coronation of the 12-year-old king in 1722, it has survived against all odds and is now in the Apollo Gallery in the Louvre. It was an innovative crown at the time. Rather than being solid gold like its predecessors, it is a light frame of wire, a setting for stones. At much the same time, the English moved from having a solid state crown with stones bolted onto it to a similar lighter frame to display diamonds. The crown, which has 8 arches, was designed by Laurent Rond, the crown jeweller, and was then made by Augustin Duflo. The stones used in it include 282 diamonds, 64 coloured stones, sapphires, rubies, topazes and emeralds, and 230 pearls. Many of the stones came from the collection of Cardinal Jules Mazarin. The largest stone used in the crown when it was made was known as the Regent and was set in the front. This 140-carat diamond found in India was originally in English hands. It was acquired in 1701 by Thomas Pitt, the father of the Earl of Chatham. He spent £20,400 on it in 1701, and he sold it in 1717 to the French regent Philippe d'Orléans for £135,000, a tidy profit. The history of this stone, which is now displayed in front of Louis XV's crown in the Louvre, deserves a video all of its own. In 1887, during the Third Republic, when other items of regalia were destroyed, the crown of Louis XV was preserved, but all the stones were replaced with paste. 2 sceptres, well, in fact a sceptre and a rod, were bestowed upon the king at his coronation, a sceptre of kingly authority and a rod of equity and virtue. The principal king's sceptre was known as the Scepter of St. Louis and may well have dated from his reign. It was a rod of gold that was topped with a large fleur-de-lis. This sceptre disappeared from the treasury in 1590 during the siege of Paris, along with the matching queen's sceptre, which was known as the Scepter of the Rose. The latter was melted down in 1590 by the monks of Saint-Denis to pay for food. Although Henry IV had a new replacement sceptre made, once the sceptre of St. Louis had disappeared in 1590, another early sceptre was pressed into service to replace it. Known as the Sceptre of Charlemagne or the Sceptre of Charles V, it still survives and is now in the Louvre, a glorious example of medieval goldsmithing. The sceptre is believed to have been made in 1379 by Charles V, but it was first used in 1380 at the coronation of his son Charles VI. It is not so much a sceptre as a staff, and was originally 3 foot 9 inches long, and you can see it being held by the Bourbon kings in their coronation portraits. It consists of a staff with a spike on the end, terminating in a round monde studded with jewels, with sapphires, rubies and pearls. The monde is topped with a fleur-de-lis that grows from it, on which is then a large image of Charlemagne enthroned and crowned. The monde itself is decorated with repoussé panels that relate aspects of the life and legend of Charlemagne. We have St. James the Great appearing to Charlemagne, requesting him to go and invade Spain. We see the blossoming of the spears of those going to die in battle with him, and St. James claiming Charlemagne's soul from the devil. The sceptre has been much repaired and altered over the centuries, it being rather badly knocked about during the endless journeys back and forth between Saint-Denis and Rheims. Part of the issue was the great length of the sceptre. It just made it more prone to damage. A significant repair took place in 1547 before the coronation of Henry II. In 1722, although placed in a brand new case, the shaft was broken when being transported for the coronation of Louis V. When the sceptre was seized in 1793 during the French Revolution, part of the shaft of it was melted down and the sceptre was reduced in length by 2 feet. Then in 1804, a separate object from the Treasury of Saint-Denis, the cantor's baton of Guillaume de Roquemont, dating from the 1390s, was added to lengthen the sceptre once again. In the 20th century, that element was removed. At the same time in 1804, the fleur-de-lis, which had been enamelled white, was stripped back to the bare gold. The rod of virtue and equity given to the king at the coronation, known as the main de justice, the hand of justice, did not survive the revolution. I say it didn't survive. There appears to have been at least 3 versions of this particular sceptre in the collection, including one said to have belonged to St. Louis and another made for King Henry IV. At least one of these was used in conjunction with the personal crown. This rod consisted of a gold shaft set with stones, with the hand of justice on top, carved of ivory. That of St. Louis was said to have been marine ivory, though tradition said that it was made from a unicorn horn. The fingers of all the hands of justice were arranged as though in blessing. It was intended to portray the hand of God blessing both king and people. The collection had a final sceptre, the so-called Scepter of Dagobert, which the Queen used at the coronation instead of a hand of justice. It was stolen from the Louvre in 1795 and has never surfaced again. The lower part of the shaft of this sceptre was decorated with panels of enamel, alternating with panels studded with gems, with turquoise, with garnets and pearls. There was feather enamelling running up the upper part of the shaft. The top of the sceptre terminated in an eagle, on whose back was a figure of a long-haired man, and the dove's wings had jewelled rosettes on them formed from emeralds and garnets. It is the most elusive of the objects in the regalia, named for Dagobert, and it has been suggested that it may indeed have been Merovingian in origin, its style evoking the design of Byzantine imperial sceptres. Another very early element of the regalia that thankfully still survives is the coronation sword, the sacred sword of the kings of France. Joyeuse, the joyful, it is now in the Louvre. The tradition is that it was the sword of Charlemagne, and it was first recorded in use at the coronation procession of Philip III in 1270. Parts of it are indeed very old, but not so ancient as to have belonged to Charlemagne. The earliest part of the sword is the blade, which is at the very latest 10th century and may indeed be late 9th century. The tradition is that the blade was forged from the spear that Longinus used to pierce the side of Christ when he was on the cross. The other elements of the sword are also very early too. The pommel, which is decorated with beautiful stylized birds that look almost Viking, Scandinavian in style, dates to the 10th or 11th century, while the crossguard dates to the 12th century, its quillion in the form of winged dragons. Even the scabbard, decorated with fleur-de-lis and studded with amethysts and sapphires, may be 13th century. During the coronation, it was girded to the king. And as at an English coronation, the king was girded with spurs too, prick spurs, and these survive. Gold set with garnets, they appear to date from the 12th century. Sadly, they were remade for Napoleon's coronation. From the early 16th century, there was a ring in the Treasury at Saint-Denis that was purported to be the ring of Louis IX and was used as a coronation ring. It bears a 14th century inscription inside that says it is the saint's own signet ring. The ring itself is made of enamelled gold, decorated with fleur-de-lis, and is set with an amethyst engraved, the depiction of St. Louis crowned, holding a scepter and orb, and with a saintly nimbus. It is now believed to date to the reign of Charles V or Charles VI at the end of the 14th century. The traditional seat that French kings were enthroned upon at their coronation still survives. It is now kept in the Cabinet of Medals in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Known as the throne of Dagobert, like the rest of the regalia, it was kept in Saint-Denis unless it was needed. The tradition that it belonged to Dagobert, the first king of the Franks, was recorded as early as the 12th century by Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis. The date of the piece is hotly debated, but for much of the last century it was believed to be 11th century. It may be that the constituent parts are of different dates. It has been suggested that the chair began life as a folding chair based on the curule chairs of ancient Rome. Up-to-date scholarship has argued that the bottom part dates from the time of Dagobert, but that the pedimented back, which stops the chair from folding, may be a 9th century addition. It has been repaired at least once early on in its history. It was also used, like St Edward's chair, its English equivalent in Westminster Abbey, as a sedilia, a seat for the priest celebrating Mass at the high altar of the Abbey church. It was multifunctional. Made of bronze, the chair was once gilded, and the remains of gilding still adhere to parts of it. The legs have claw feet, and they terminate with a leopard's heads, one of which is probably of the 12th century. Now there is one more item to discuss which provides the rationale for holding the French coronation at Rheims rather than in Paris, and that is the Saint Ampulla, the Holy Ampulla, a container for the holy oil used at anointing. It was first used at the coronation of Louis VII in 1131, and it was used at every coronation until that of Louis XVI in 1775. At the centre of the Holy Ampulla was a small Roman glass vial containing the oil. This was said to have been found in the 12th century within the sarcophagus of Saint-Remy at the Abbey of Saint-Remy in Rheims. When it was discovered, it was assumed to be the vial containing the holy oil that was given to Saint-Remy by an angel from heaven for the baptism of a moribund pagan, which according to later medieval legend had then been used by Saint-Remy as holy chrism at the baptism of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. His baptism took place in 508. So with such a pedigree, it's no surprise that the medieval French kings wanted to use it for their coronation anointing. The ampulla was a sacred relic and it belonged to the Abbey of Saint-Remy, and they closely guarded it. So French kings had to travel to Rheims if they wanted to be anointed with this oil. By the time of the Revolution, the ampulla was kept in a large late medieval reliquary, which was a medallion. And at the centre of it was a representation of a dove, the Holy Spirit, which was designed so that the glass ampulla itself appeared as though it were held between the feet of the dove. The reliquary then had a chain so that it could be suspended around the neck of the abbot of Saint-Remy when he brought it solemnly to Reims Cathedral for the coronation. When used, a small part of the oil from the ampulla was removed and then was mixed with chrism. The ampulla was destroyed in 1793 when the National Convention dispatched Philippe Roule to smash it, and he did so publicly with a hammer at the foot of a statue of Louis XV in the centre of the Place Royale in Reims. Crowns, sceptres and other items of regalia are not simply objects that reflect the political power of a king in a given moment. They are symbols that are designed to express continuity between the past and the present, and therefore political legitimacy. In medieval France, legitimacy needed to be expressed through symbolism, as the French king's rule was often rather shaky, because France was a very decentralised state. The Capetian dynasty's direct rule was often confined to the hinterland around Paris, the Ile-de-France, but the rest of their realm was made up of large semi-autonomous duchies who were, in theory at least, vassals of the crown, but were often in conflict with them. The regalia provided symbolic legitimacy through association. The objects related to Dagobert, Clovis and Charlemagne expressed the medieval French sovereigns' notion of themselves and their position of authority, that they were the successors of the great Merovingian and Carolingian empires of the Franks. This notion was partly aspirational and partly an example of hubris in the face of a very different feudal reality. The idea was that he who wore Charlemagne's crown is Charlemagne remade, at least in theory. It was only in the later 17th century, during the reign of Louis XIV, that this political ambition of the French crown was more fully realised, and a consolidated French state under the autocratic rule of the King of France then emerged. Items associated with St. Louis offered a different value, a spiritual property. They had a relic quality to them, conferring on the wearer or possessor some of the saint's potent spiritual power. Similar political and spiritual legitimacy was expressed through the English medieval regalia too. It was King Henry III, influenced by this French practice, who first started to use regalia associated with St. Edward the Confessor. The equivalent to the possession of Charlemagne, Dagobert and St. Louis' regalia were items associated with the confessor, some removed from his grave: St. Edward's crown, St. Edward's staff, St. Edward's robe and of course St. Edward's chair. These were both symbols of continuity and also holy relics. There was a distinct political messaging here too, that he who possessed the royal emblems of the saintly and penultimate Saxon king was his legitimate successor. What a magnificent collection of objects the regalia of the Ancien regime must have been, reflecting the French crown's long history, its splendour and its aspirations. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.